Welcome to episode 13 of Apollo's project, Apologetics. Today, I would like to look at common evolutionary arguments that involve circular reasoning, or also known as question begging. And I'm not going to do here a full analysis and internal critique of naturalistic, materialistic, uh, evolutionary arguments or Darwinism. I simply want to look at the logic of certain claims that are made, even by some scientists, in the claims made for the biological theory of evolution, which doesn't just touch on biology, of course, but my point is not going to be to give a full biblical overview of this subject. It's not going to be to undo every bit of evidence or to look at that and examine that. I simply want to look at, do we see circular reasoning within these evolutionary arguments? And I would say argue that in many of them, that is exactly what we see. And if circular reasoning is used, which is a logical fallacy, that means the argument is lacking justification. It's lacking verifiability. Circular reasoning involves assuming something without proving it, assuming something, or it ends in a vicious circle, which is a logical term or category for when something depends on something else to be true, and then that thing depends on the other thing to be true. Now, some people would accuse Christians of doing this by saying, well, we believe in God, God spoke in the Bible tells us about God. And we could look at that claim, and yes, that could be viciously circular, but that is not the claim that Christians make or should make. Our claim is different. But anyway, we look at circular reasoning because logic is a reflection of God's nature and character. It's an immutable, unchanging standard of truth that is immaterial, that is universal, that cannot be used without being assumed. So we could even argue, in a sense, logic needs to be justified. Of course, we can't not think in logical categories, but why is that justified? Well, I believe it is justified and only justified by recognizing the God who is the standard and reference point for truth, who creates and upholds this world according to his nature and character, which is truth, that he is the God who cannot lie, and therefore logic is part of his character, and as we use it, we demonstrate our knowledge of God. And even if we use it to make arguments against God, not that arguments against God are logical, but even if we use categories of logic to make such arguments, we're actually showing in a formative contradiction that we know God. But logic represents fundamental, universal, immaterial, unchanging laws of thought. For example, the law of non-contradiction. The truth does not contradict itself. That A cannot be both A and non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. That there's a law of identity. This is this and not that. That we can distinguish between things. Logic cannot be accounted for in a worldview of naturalism, materialism. So the naturalist, who often argues the case for evolution, they tell us we need to use our reason and be more logical. And we could fairly ask them, why? Why would your worldview require logic? Our worldview as believers would require logic because we follow him who is the truth. But your worldview, logic is either just a construct of the human mind or is just a chemical byproduct of physics, biology, chemistry, and motion. It has no truth, let alone authority. It's simply man-made conventions of thought that are subject to change and just used because it works. Well, it only works for certain reasons if other things hold to be true as well. So logic demands a justified explanation for why it works and can be trusted. Otherwise, it would violate its own principles. Question begging, assuming logic in order to use logic. I argue that only the biblical worldview can account for laws of logic because it presupposes the self-consistency of the transcendent creator God of the Bible, who is the ultimate standard and reference point for truth by his nature and character. He is the God who cannot lie. Not only that, but he sovereignly upholds his creation in such a way that his creatures, especially us who are made in his image, can learn truth, knowledge, and reality. Not only that, we must learn truth, knowledge, and reality because we are accountable before God ethically, so that there is a bridge between the is-ought distinction. Even if you can prove logic, empirical facts, this and that, you can never require anything of anyone by those things. Those are just what is. It's a leap to go to what ought from there. Now, logic involves two main ideas which claims must possess in order to be true. So for something to be logical, sometimes people say, well, this defies logic. Like they say, well, Jesus rising from the dead defies logic. Actually, while that is an amazing claim that Jesus rose from the dead, there's nothing in Jesus rising from the dead that defies logic. It doesn't break a rule of logic that someone rises from the dead. They may say it's improbable. They may say it's not something that they can explain, or they may say they don't believe it. But that doesn't make it illogical. Illogical means that there's some contradiction or something that's not justified or verified, something there's no evidence for, that's not proven. And so logic involves the two main ideas. In order for something to be true, it requires both of these things, consistency and justification. So errors in logic, and this is what we should look for, errors in logic either involve inconsistency, arbitrariness, or both. And so what is going on is something that contradicts itself, that is inconsistent. That is logically self-contradictory. And things that are contradictory cannot be both true. One of the rules of logic. Now, things don't always contradict themselves, but sometimes they assume something without proving it or make a leap that is not justified logically. So circular reasoning, so invalidity, when something is invalid logically, it involves a contradiction. So you can make an argument that is valid. There is no contradiction involved, but it is unjustified. Circular reasoning or question begging is not necessarily invalid, it's not self-contradictory, but an inference is arbitrary. That's what circular reasoning or question begging entails. Now, this can come in multiple different formats. Circular reasoning or question begging is, I think, the most common. Arbitrarily assumes what it seeks to prove. So it says that something must be this way without proving it, because here it is. Or it can be the non sequitur, which is Latin for it doesn't follow, an unjustified inference that does not necessarily follow from premises. So this can be kind of hard to pick up on sometimes, where it says, okay, there's step 1, step 2, step 3, and then it goes to step 5. And it's like, well, wait a second. Step 3 doesn't go to step 5, but it kind of seems like it does at first, but there's an unjustified leap or something doesn't follow. Or you say, well, I'll give you an example. If you say some people are struck by lightning, that's true. therefore it is likely that I will be struck by lightning, that's not necessarily justified. It may be true that it may happen, but it's not necessarily justified that because some people are struck by lightning, that it'll be likely that I will be struck by lightning tomorrow. It could also be a loaded question, a question that assumes an answer implicit within it. So you say, okay, give me 5 reasons why elephants are orange. Well, the question assumes something, or why are elephants orange? This happens in all of the textbooks. How do you think humans evolved? How do you think dinosaurs evolved with feathers or something like this? It's like, well, isn't that assuming that that happened? But they leap past justification to just infer, speculate. Or something could be a tautology, a definitional statement that adds no information, right? So a tautology would be, sometimes it's something that's logically valid and it's true, but it's just a definition, like the statement that comes up in classes on logic and philosophy a lot, the statement that all bachelors are married men. That statement is analytically true. It is logically sound. It's true by definition. It cannot be disproven because the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. But that adds no information about either bachelors or unmarried men. It also adds no information about the world around us. Natural selection is kind of the tautology, or survival of the fittest. How do you know that they're the fittest? Well, they survived. Well, why did they survive? Well, because they're the fittest. Okay, so let me just provide some examples of evolutionary argumentation that I believe involves arbitrary circular reasoning. And I'm only going to select a few. But we've seen, of course, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park talks about, they find dinosaur DNA in mosquitoes, and they got trapped in the amber, and so they were able to reconstruct the DNA, fill the gaps, all this stuff. And the famous line, that comes from this is life finds a way, from Jeff Goldblum's character, right? But so this is inferring the mechanism by which life originates to be evolution because life found a way. So it's looking at current life, the fact of current life, and saying, okay, current life came from somewhere. Okay, that's true, right? With you so far. But then it says, okay, but since we are here, since life is here, life must have found a way to evolve, originate from non-life and evolve to being what it is today. That is where the circular reasoning, the question begging comes in, is that, well, we exist today as life, therefore we must have evolved. The therefore hides in it a leap that is not logically justified. Not that it's not even empirical. It's a statement that logically is arbitrary. It doesn't contradict. It's just arbitrary. Now this happens. I also have a scientific American article here from George Wald from 1954, The Origin of Life, which basically states this circular evolutionary argument. Evolution must have taken place because here we are. Now maybe I'm being unfair. The common objection, especially when the overwhelming improbability or even impossibility of evolution is presented, you say, well, this is just so improbable or impossible. Number one, you can't get life from non-life. That breaks rules of logic. That breaks everything we see in empirical science. That breaks even the principles that we see today at work in science. You're assuming they must have worked differently in the past. even if you say, okay, well, mathematically, what are the odds of all the right factors lining up with each other at the right time, the right place, in order to produce life? Doesn't that just seem not only improbable, but that it was impossible that that would ever occur? And someone says, well, yeah, but it must have happened because here we are. But that argument is arbitrary. I could make that same argument, even though it would be arbitrary. I think it's true, but I think that this is an arbitrary form of argumentation to say, well, we're here, so God must have created us. I believe both of those statements. I believe that we're here, and I believe that God created us. But I can't just say, because we're here, God must have created us, unless I'm showing that in some way. So George Wald writes, the reasonable view, okay, that's loaded language, the reasonable view was to believe in spontaneous generation. The only alternative to believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation. There is no third position. So I actually appreciate his honesty here, because he said, look, there's two options. Now he calls reasonable view spontaneous creation. That means spontaneous generation. That means coming out of nothing, basically, for no reason, spontaneously, no reason that can be explained. He says, okay, so we've got two options here. Spontaneous generation, it's the evolutionary argument, out of nothing, or out of pre-existing materials that are non-living, or supernatural creation in a one-time event that's not repeated. There is no third position. He says one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that spontaneous generation, living organism, is impossible. He says, okay, look. He says, I'll give you the idea that it is impossible for life and all that exists today to generate spontaneously. It would be impossible, except for the fact, he says, that it happened. Right? So he says, I'll give you that it seems very improbable to the point of being impossible, yet here we are, as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. That is vicious circular reasoning. It's saying evolution is impossible. Evolution is improbable to the point of being impossible, yet it must have happened because we exist. That is circular reasoning. That's the circular reasoning in Life Finds a Way. Paul Davies in Was Life on Earth Born Lucky? In New Scientist in 2003, this journal article talking about the origin of life. Where did life come from? So he says, nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organized themselves into the first living cell. Okay? I mean, we can appreciate his candor, his seeming honesty here. He says, but it's building in a few key assumptions that are circular, that are question-begging, that are arbitrary. Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cells. That's assuming that a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. It's assuming something that was not witnessed, that you do not see in science. It's arbitrary and it's non-scientific. But here's where it gets tricky. It takes a fact or truth, present existence of life. Life exists right now. Biological life exists. But the question begging goes in like this. It's the assumption that a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organized into the first living cell by an unknown process. That it must have happened this way in a process we don't know, but lifeless cells must have emerged to become life, is conflating the existence of life, truth, with the mechanism of how life emerged, which is an unjustified assumption. So they kind of blend things together. They don't mix it with something that's not totally true. They mix it with truth. Life exists, but then they say, because life exists, we can know that it came from a mixture of lifeless chemicals. It's assuming the present existence of life proves that lifeless chemicals became living in the past. The illogical aspect here is, number one, things do not become their opposites. Life does not come from non-life. And it's also unscientific. Everybody talks about, oh, well, it's empirical science, empirical science. We observe these things scientifically. But no one has ever observed this. It is inferred, but it's inferred in a way that is question-begging, that is breaking the requirement of arbitrariness. Well, it's being arbitrary. It's breaking the requirement of non-arbitrariness. It's unscientific that all scientific observation has demonstrated that life only comes from life, which is called the law of biogenesis. So this statement, even though it's in a scientific journal called The New Scientist, nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organized themselves into the first living cell. It's question-begging. It's illogical because it assumes things become their opposites. It is unscientific because this has not been observed, and it builds in the question-begging assumption that is assumed instead of proven. Take kind of a tweet or Facebook post here. This type of argument is very common on the internet, but also among scientists, so don't feel bad. This person says, imagine dropping a single microbe onto a lifeless alien planet, then coming back a few years later and seeing buzzing rainforests, giant sea creatures, an advanced civilization flying rockets into space, all descendants of that one microbe. That actually happened here. Maybe our common ancestor was planted here by someone, or maybe it spontaneously formed, but it was such an important little microbe, and all trees and sharks and lions and jellyfish and algae and accountants and zebras and ants and corals and lizards descended from it. I mean, the question begging here should be fairly obvious. Hey, look at all this life. Must have come from a microbe over billions of years. How do we know? Because here we are. Look at all this. Well, where did it come from? Well, it came from a microbe. Well, how do you know that? Because here we are, right? That's the circularity in this type of argumentation. Ray Comfort gives this great statement about irreducible complexity, meaning there are multiple systems, not just in the human body, but in all over in creation, that require different parts of the system to come into existence at the same time. And many would say, well, it must have happened that way because here they are, so it must have happened endogenously. But that's not that's not proven. That's just assumed. And so, for example, heart needs lungs, needs oxygen. Lungs need blood pumping, need heart. That all must come into existence at once. There are all kinds of things like that in creation. But Ray Comfort, the evangelist, says, how did the body survive when the heart hadn't yet evolved? Or was the body alive without a heart? How did that work? Or how about the skin? Did it exist before blood formed? How did the skin stay alive without blood? If the skin was able to live in that state, where did the oxygen come from? And why did the blood suddenly need oxygen to keep it alive? Did the lungs form because they were needed to pull in oxygen for the heart? Then which came first, the heart, blood, veins, skin, or lungs? Did one survive without the other? If they did survive, why was there a need for it to evolve to a state where they couldn't exist without the others? And so people would scoff and make fun of this, but it really is a key idea that's brought out that if my lungs need also a heart, then how did the body evolve to have lungs? And if the lungs were, as it were, still waiting for the heart, then it were in some ways able to survive without it, then why does it evolve to become dependent on the heart? Right? No one can say how this mechanism takes place. They can just assume, well, it must have worked at some point because here we are. Or the thing that's popular to assume now is multiverses. People assume there are several, universes, possible universes, and we just happen to be in the one where it worked out this way. Textbook, Biology and the Unity and Diversity of Life from 1992. The first self-replicating systems must have emerged in this organic soup. Really? They must have? So we have self-replicating systems. I've got it. Where do they come from? Well, it has to be that they came from this biological soup. It's question begging, circular reasoning. Genes on Ice in Science Digest, 1981. A century of sensational discoveries in biological sciences has taught us that life only arises from life. Yet they infer from that that life rises from non-life. They have to for biological evolution to be the case. Here's another one. Argument people make in textbooks is the homology of vertebrate limbs. Like, okay, well, these kind of look like each other. They must have evolved from a common ancestor. And they name, the radius and ulna, and they say, hey, look at your arm. You have a radius and ulna. Well, guess what? These animals have a radius and ulna. And obviously the animals did not name them that. They know that, and we know that. But here's the thing. They define homology, which is that they have these types of bone structures, as being evidence for evolution from a common ancestor. But this is basically what happened. They say similar looking and functioning structures in vertebrate limbs, animals with backbones, is what a vertebrate is, skeletal form. Darwin regarded this as evidence for common ancestry. So he says here, if we suppose that an early progenitor, the archetype, as it may be called, of all mammals, birds, and reptiles, had its limbs constructed on an existing pattern, the similar framework of bones in the hands of a man, the wing of a bat, the fin of a porpoise, the leg of a horse, at once explain themselves with a theory of descent with slow, slight modification. Now, there's question begging in that statement. Darwin is saying, hey, look, there are these similar looking bone structures in different mammal types. That must mean they have descended from a common ancestor. That's arbitrary question begging. And so his theory is that these species must have descended as a class and a group from common parents. So the theory or the assumption is there's a link between homology, the looking the same of these bone structures, and common descent. This is central to Darwin's theory. So homology was redefined. The previous definition was observation of similar structure. The redefinition was similar structures because of assumed common ancestry. Now this started to get into a philosophical problem. The philosophical logical error here was question begging. If homology, meaning having similar bone structure, is defined as evidence of common descent, then it cannot be proved as common ancestry, because here's what happens. Structural similarity is called homology. Okay, no problem there so far. But then that said, that the logical leap here that is unjustified is that because these bone structures look similar, that must mean they have come from a common ancestor. Okay, well, how do you know that they've come from a common ancestor? Well, because they have these similar bone structures. Why do they have these similar bone structures? Because they come from a common ancestor. It assumes what it seeks to prove. That's like saying, after 1859, well, Ernst Mayr says there was only one definition of homology. And so this error is there must be evidence for common ancestry before they can be called homologous. So you have to have common ancestry first before you say, well, the structural similarity called homology shows common ancestry. So the error is this: common ancestry demonstrates homology, which demonstrates common ancestry. Uh, they argue similar structures point to common ancestry, and we see evidence for common ancestry in homology. That's circular reasoning, and scientific philosophers have pointed this out. This one guy, Ronald H. Brady, says by making our explanation into the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis but belief. We are so convinced that our explanation is true that we no longer see any need to distinguish it from the situation we are trying to explain. Dogmatic endeavors of this kind must eventually leave the realm of science. So that's kind of like saying, hey, look, all these cars have similar structure. That must mean they came from a previous common car. Why? Because they have common structures. Why do they have common structures? Because they came from a common car. You can kind of see that it doesn't really work that way in the sense that people assume that it does. And so Darwin said it is therefore of the highest importance to gain clear insight to the means of modification. So it's like, well, how does this actually happen if it indeed did happen? So recognizing commonality does not observe the mechanism or how and why structures are similar or homologous. Just saying, okay, well, hey, horses, humans, bats, uh, they have this similar bone structure within their arms and legs and these kind of things. That must prove that they have a common ancestor and that they evolved in this way. Actually doesn't prove anything of the kind. So it's not tied to an observable biological process. It's just an assumption made. Now, I'm going to end this particular discussion there. I will continue this because I would like to talk about geology and fossils in the attempt to use fossils in evidence for evolution and fossils in attempt to argue for a certain date. But fossils cannot be used as evidence for evolution, and I will demonstrate logically why next time, and I will also seek to demonstrate the circularity of fossils and rock layers and the circularity inherent in trying to basically date those relative to one another.